to hold prior approval rights under Class Q of the development order. The Parish Council draws the committee's attention to the terms applicable to Class Q, which include the change of use of a building and any land from use as an agricultural building to a use falling within the Class C3 dwelling house. A development, together with building operations reasonably necessary to convert the building to a dwelling house. The building for conversion must be capable of functioning as a dwelling and capable of conversion. The Parish Council notes that the Class Q prior approval was given to an earlier application, 22000745 ARN, for conversion of a machinery store to a residential dwelling. The report gives significant weight to this Class Q. The proposal before the committee is to replace the existing agricultural building with a newly constructed detached two-storey market dwelling of larger size than the existing building it sets out to replace. Parish Council contends that the proposal does not meet the Class Q permitted development criteria, nor the policies set out in the local plan and the Wychford neighbourhood plan. It amounts to encroachment development within the countryside. The PC therefore contends that the policies set out in the local plan and the Wychford neighbourhood plan should be afforded full weight by the committee when making its decision, and requests the committee to uphold the integrity of the local plan and the Wychford neighbourhood plan and refuse the application. Thank you.
Well, I think, members, it's quite clear where Wychford Parish Council come from on this matter. You have the opportunity now to question them. Councillor Trett.
Was the decision by Wychford Parish Council unanimous about?
Yes, it was.
Okay, thank you. And the Class Q conversion had to be accepted, but it seems to me that there's a possible loophole here that one can get permission for residential dwelling, which should be on the same plan, and then find it was the goalposts have changed. Is that your interpretation as well?
Correct.
Any more questions for the Parish Council? No, thank you very much indeed. We now turn back to the officer, and I think it's there's some complicated questions have been asked, and I think one of them is conversion. What exactly is a conversion? And I'm sure the members of the committee would like to know your view.
Thank you, Chair. Before I answer that, and yes, indeed, a tricky question, one we do grapple with quite often for Class Qs, I would like to clarify that the application here is a full application. So that doesn't require the same considerations as Class Q. So Class Q is established at the national level. And yes, there is a high bar when moving through the criterion for Class Q, including capable of conversion, and that is a key test. That is only relevant insofar as the process of Class Q. When we move outside of that for the planning application, I'm not suggesting this is a barn conversion. I fully acknowledge it's a replacement dwelling, but what I'm advising is that in my professional view, applying the test of conversion here isn't particularly fruitful to this assessment. I think what is the key point is that the Class Q consent stands alone. It has established principle of residential dwelling, and therefore that's the principle of residential within the site that's been established. So the actual concern over conversion, I'm happy to kind of go a bit more detail about that, but I don't think it's necessarily particularly a helpful discussion because it's one which is wrapped up in a lot of case law, but it is related to Class Q largely, as opposed to the planning policies which are before us and which we're assessing this. To further clarify, whilst I fully understand the policies exist, Growth 2, Policy SS1 of the Whitcham Neighbour Plan, what I am arguing, and I'd like to make clear, is that it's the material consideration of the Class Q consent that is warranting a departure from those policies. So I'm not saying that they shouldn't apply. I'm saying there is material considerations which are overriding them, particularly in this instance, and that is solely the Class Q consent here. As a point of further clarification, the Class Q consent was validated in June 2022, determined in September, and provided it is completed within 3 years, so they still have quite a lot of time on that clock. It is still very much an extant consent. So that's a realistic fallback position for them to deliver a dwelling within that site. So.
Thank you very much. We're now on to the stage where members can ask the officer questions. Councillor Wilson, that was coming up quickly.
Thank you, Jim. The difference between this and the Glass Q thing is the stable block in front of it, isn't it? And that this needs to be, as on this thing, it's been incorporated in the garden curtilage of the house. Does that mean that they can then convert the stable block into something else as well? And what's the restrictions on that area?
So by virtue of amalgamating it and changing the use into residential curtilage, it becomes an incidental outbuilding to that dwelling. Class Q is only applicable, Class Q as in permitted development rights to convert to dwellings is only applicable when it's in agricultural use, and you can demonstrate that. In this instance, it would be how we treat any normal annex, any normal outbuilding. You would have to apply for planning permission to get another dwelling in that location. As for restrictions on other buildings, that's been restricted through a condition within Appendix 1 of the report to remove any other outbuildings being erected.
But that means presumably they could still use it for parking cars rather than horses, couldn't they?
Yes, so it's been amalgamated into the scheme as an incidental outbuilding. Incidental can be a garage, it can be a domestic store, it can be anything to serve the dwelling. Incidental meaning that it is, subsidiary to the dwelling, it's ancillary to the dwelling. It won't be necessarily stabled anymore, because it's not being proposed to be retained for agricultural use.
Councillor Trapp.
I'm slightly puzzled by on the page 5, right at the bottom. This is the responses from consultees, environmental health. The penultimate paragraph advises that the agricultural building will be demolished and an adjacent agricultural building will be relocated. Is that right? So
if you remember that there was an area on the site where some tractors were to the rear,
Yes.
as a further barn to
Yes.
the north. So that's outside of the application, it's outside of the red line. It is acknowledged within my report that this is referenced, but I have no control under this application to consider that. Its removal and replacement is subject to either permitted development rights the applicant has under Part 6, which is agricultural, or alternatively a planning application if they wanted to do anything else with that barn. Irrespective of whether it stays or whether it goes, I've concluded the dwelling is acceptable regardless.
Right. So that there's still a proposal that the agricultural building will be demolished and replaced.
It's merely a statement on a plan. It's not something that I can control under this application. So if this was approved, it wouldn't be consented as part of this.
Thank you.
Councillor Sharp.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions, and around the consent on Q consent or whatever, does it have to be on the same footprint as the existing building or the existing barn? And the second thing, is does the consent queue have to be in the same materials, i.e. in the corrugated iron that it, or material that it is there now?
Thank you. So yes, and this is potentially what we were discussing earlier with regards to being capable of conversion. The class Q, in order to benefit from that permitted development right, it has to take place, it has to be a barn that's capable of being converted, and that means you can't extend it. It has to be able to be used on its own, structurally sound, and in that respect, it wouldn't be expected that you replace a lot of the materials. They would usually be like minor repairs. What the Act does allow for is for the insertion of windows and doors, etc., to make it habitable. But yes, it has to be the same footprint and effectively using the same materials.
If I can come back, Chair, sorry.
Yes, if you
Just one,
wish.
the application we're looking at today, looking at it, that extend, I'm just talking about the buildings rather than the curtilage. That's a bigger footprint than the existing barn, certainly on the, as you look at it on the left-hand side. Would I be right in saying that?
It does have a rear extension, so it extends slightly further beyond the plane of the footprint. But if you also note, it's much narrower than the actual barn, so it's not a drastic difference, but it does go beyond. Yes, it does go beyond the footprint, but also goes within the footprint in certain areas as well.
Councillor Huffer.
I think Councillor Sharp has asked my question. No, that's fine. But to go back to this conversion thing, so when the Q consent was granted in September 2022, do we know how long that barn had been there?
So there's a criterion within class Q, much like many permitted development rights, that requires it to have been in agricultural use either since 2013 or before. There's effectively, it has to be usually a 10-year period to actually benefit from the right, as well as meeting a number of other criteria regarding tenancy, etc. So yes, a minimum of 10 years.
Minimum of 10 years, thank you.
Councillor Trapp.
I'm talking again about the Class Q conversion. I was intrigued by the barn having big sliding doors. And I was wondering how that would have been done with Class Q, whether.
There are plans. Unfortunately, I've not got them here in front of me, but it was like many barns. There are windows and doors inserted, and often the doors are tacked onto the sides with some high-level glazing placed in. That's how the effect is achieved, but it's obviously nowhere near realistic.
Thank you very much.
Now we're finishing with questions to the officers and are about to move on to the debate. No questions for officers? No. So we move on to debate. Members, it's up to you. Christine Ambrose-Smith.
I think the officers have put an awful lot of work and consideration into this. We've had an awful lot of information here. I would like to propose that we go with the officers' recommendation for approval.
Okay, anyone, next person, Councillor Huffer.
I have to tell you, this application gives me deep disquiet, deep disquiet. I have a horrible feeling this is another little loophole that planning agents find and exploit. This does not sit well with me, and I cannot support this application. I think this is a troubling loophole that needs to be closed, because, okay, convert that building, but don't exploit the Class Q to put up something that you really want. That's just my personal, I just think, I'm sorry, I find it deeply troubling.
So are you opposing it in any other way?
Not at this stage, but I might
Okay.
come back. We'll have to see.
Councillor Akinwale.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'd like to second Councillor, sorry. Yeah, sir. I'd like to second, to support the officer's recommendation. I think there's been a lot of thought to the recommendation and into the proposals. I'd like to second to support the proposal, please. Thank you.
We haven't had a proposal yet, so
that I haven't, Christine has proposed accepting it. I haven't done anything yet.
Yeah, second, Councillor Christine, please. Thank you.
So we've had Christine proposed and accepted. The Councillor Akinwale is seconding in that. Is that correct? Yes, you're seconding that. Let me write these down. And we have now Councillor Sharp. I beg your pardon. You are.
Thank you, Chair. I did it to Councillor Huffer just now. I actually taken what I was going to say a lot of. I've got grave concerns about this, and I can see this the dilemma we're in, and being cynical. The applicant has got a Class Q permitted. He's got permitted development, and it was only as recently as December last year. For a corrugated barn, and as Councillor Trapp says, with huge sliding doors. I mean, you could have a lovely conservatory on the back there, couldn't you? And then the footprint is, which is what I was trying to, is different. So I understand. I think this particular application has put the authority in a very, very difficult position because of this Class Q consent, which is, I think, is being done purely to obviously get the establishment of development there, and then once you've got that establishment development, it's much easier to change. So like Councillor Huffer, I've got grave concerns.
Okay. Right. Councillor Holtzman.
I would like to join Councillor Huffer and Councillor Sharp in voicing concerns about this application, because as has been pointed out, I don't think there was any, when the Class Q case was made, I don't think anyone really wanted to live in a corrugated barn house, which I mean was pretty awful from the design drawings. I can see that the proposed development would actually make for a very nice dwelling in line with the proposal that's been accepted next door. But I can also see, I mean, it's the same applicant. And they've clearly now used the established application they had to kind of like propose something that is optically in line. And there is no reason for us to believe that we're not going to find ourselves in a year here with a Class Q for the barn at the back and another house. Having read through the previous applications related, Witchford Council has not made any, had any concerns about the replacement of the originally existing house with another dwelling, which seems fair. And I think their concern about this group of dwellings expanding is very valid. I think the problem is also that if we approve this as stands, we're kind of like literally saying that everyone who has a 10-year-old agricultural barn within East Cambridgeshire can go via Class Q and make this into a dwelling. I very much appreciate the expert guidance of the officers to say that we can be very concerned and still find ourselves in a pickle. So I have not a very good kind of like suggestion of how we solve that, but I just would like to share my concern about this situation in general.
Have we got any more comments? Councillor Trout.
I also share the disquiet that Councillor Holtzman, Councillor Sharp and Councillor Huffer uttered. And I remember an application we had in Brinkley, which was a Plan Q, Class Q conversion, and that was for moving it slightly and doing things to it, and we refused that. We had a barn conversion in Swaffham Bullbeck, which went down, and for reasons that there was, but that was also had to be refused, but actually was accepted by the planning committee in the end. And I think we are actually looking at this. Here we have something which is, I've got this problem that every barn is going to be converted. And everything, I'm not sure how long ago that barn was actually being used for agricultural purposes, but that it has been, looks like it has not been used for many years. And I'm really actually very much against this kind of development by the back door. I think that they should be lucky enough to get the Class Q conversion and then stick with that and not ask for more. So I shall be voting against.
I get the impression from what members are saying that they're fairly all agreed on disagreeing with the officer and not approving this. We have we have a proposal from Councillor Ambrose Smith. So if you wish to vote against the officer's decision, we need to have planning reasons now as to why that's doing. So the first and seconder or any others could converse now, or you could seek officer advice.
Technically, Chair, I haven't proposed anything yet, but I would be happy to propose something if somebody could give me something in terms of planning law. The only thing I can come up with is policy SS1 of the Witchford neighbourhood plan. And I really appreciate that. I think that the applicant has put us between a rock and a hard place, I'll be honest. This is an invidious decision to try and have to make, because I know that the planning department feel that they haven't got anywhere else to turn. And this is just a gut feeling for me. This is just giving me huge disquiet. And I know that's, you can't put gut feeling down on as a reason for a refusal.
Councillor Holtzman.
Thank you. I have a question for the planning officers. So if we were to refuse this, is there any case law that might support our case?
If I may, Chair, I mean, you're not worrying about case law here because it's legitimate for the committee to refuse planning permission. There's no legal impediment for you to refuse planning permission because you have a planning application. You're entitled to take into account all the material considerations and come down on one side or the other. It's the risk is more around what policies would you apply to the development, because the development, if you just leave aside the Class Q permission for one moment, the development is for the replacement of an existing building in the countryside. So if there were no Class Q permission and this came before you, you're still dealing with the replacement of an existing building. So policy SS1 of the Witchford neighbourhood plan, absolutely. Unless I'm misreading it, doesn't appear to apply to replacement buildings in the countryside. It applies to a restriction against new buildings in the countryside that aren't placement buildings. So you have to turn to the local plan, and the local plan has a policy on replacement buildings in the countryside, and that's EMP4. And that policy does allow for the replacement of buildings in the countryside because replacement of buildings doesn't have a material greater impact as long as it's controlled on the openness and the character of the countryside. It doesn't support the replacement buildings if it's changing from an agricultural building to a dwelling without a viability or an assessment on whether or not the agricultural use should continue. But the Class Q permission makes that very difficult, because what you're going to have to argue is it doesn't comply with EMP4 because we don't want to replace buildings that are agricultural to dwellings. But the Class Q permission, which when you look at the plans shows you a big 4 or 5 bedroom house in the countryside, converting that building, that would be a really difficult point to argue at an appeal, to say that the committee dismissed that decision and then jumped from saying, we're going to dismiss that Class Q and we're going to go back to first principles and say, you can't have a new dwelling here because you're replacing an existing agricultural building. So a long and short of it is that you're dealing with an application for a replacement building anyway. The Class Q permission makes that even more difficult. The neighbourhood plan policy prevents you from granting permission for new buildings in the countryside, but it's silent on replacement buildings. Does that make sense?
It kind of does, although we're now still replacing kind of like the Q permission. Oh, we're still replacing the queue permission with something that then is outside it. And I understand your concerns around saying that, you know, the principle of someone being able to live there has been established, and the curtilage is in the new proposal within kind of like acceptable bounds. But it still gives me the creeps.
Councillor Goodhart.
Good, thank you, Chair. Simon, just a quick one for you. What about within the development envelope of the building of the development plan of Witchford? Previous applications have been refused because it doesn't come within the development area.
Like I was trying to say earlier, the difficulty you have is that you're not dealing with a new dwelling in a field. You're dealing with a new dwelling that replaces an existing building anyway, even if there were no Class Q permission. So you have to factor in the existing building will be demolished and replaced. So the material impact on the countryside, you'd need to judge the difference between the new building and the old. That's your judgment on countryside. And then when you come to the use, you're looking at a residential use of that new building, and the current building has an agricultural use. But the Class Q permission has already, the council have already agreed through planning legislation that a house is acceptable in this location through Class Q. So when you get to an appeal, you're going to be performing all sorts of cartwheels to demonstrate what harm it is you're trying to prevent. And you can't prevent a new dwelling here, and you can't prevent impact on countryside because there's an existing building there. So what is your objective? If I don't understand what harm it is you're trying to prevent, and that's essentially why Holly's come down and performed the cartwheels herself and reluctantly recommended approval.
Councillor Wilson.
I think we don't like it, but I don't think we can do much about it. And for example, if the applicant actually started building his Class Q house and decided after he got about halfway through building it that nobody would live in it because it was horrible, which I think is what some of us think, he could then come along and say, can I replace this horrible house with a nicer house? And we wouldn't be able to do anything about it. So I think we are stuck with accepting reluctantly Holly's recommendation to us to approve this particular building. In fact, you know, if we weren't worried about our principles on these things and we didn't care that much, this building is going to be a significant improvement on what's there at the moment. And it would certainly be a significant improvement on a Class Q replacement of the existing building. It's got, if it has there anything, it's got to have a garden in front of it as well, which would make it much more acceptable than what we've got with a big lump of concrete in front of it. I mean, the thing on the whole is an improvement to the countryside. If you happen to be driving down this very remote road, which not many people do. And I don't like the idea of someone basically over a couple of years managing to get something which we wouldn't normally accept, but I don't think we've got any choice. So I think somebody proposed that we accepted the officer's recommendation, so I'm going to second on accepting the officer's recommendation with a very reluctant, but I think no more reluctant than their officer's reluctance to accept it.
It's quite obvious when you read the agenda, just when you first get it, that this was going to be a tricky one. And as I understand it, we have a proposal from Councillor Huffer to accept, Christine Ambrose Smith. We have a proposal to accept the officer's recommendation. And I think Councillor Holtzman, you're seconding it. Thank you very much indeed. So we have a proposal and a seconder. we have, I think, quite a lot of reluctance, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is how you raise your hand, and that will make the decision. So, are those in favour of accepting the officer's recommendation, please raise their hands.
Those who are voting against?
And have we got any abstentions?
So that's 5 votes for, 3 votes against, and 2 abstentions.
Well, the application succeeds. I think it's fair to say that a lot of us will have the same feelings, but it's been a very tricky one, and I think one that justifies a case coming to the planning committee, to be honest. And I thank members for all their different points of view and their thoughts and their consideration, which is great. So that one is finished, and that one is approved. So we now move on to item number 8. You can leave now, sir, if you wish.
Thank you.
Right, planning
Yeah.
manager.
Thank you, Chair. So for new members, you'll be getting used to these charts and tables now. Hopefully, the more you see them, the more you understand them. So, but as you can see on performance, the top table, major applications where we're usually at 100% on determining those within time, minors as well. And then the only area where we're slipping a bit is on non-material amendments, that's NMAs, and DISs, that's discharge of conditions. And you get so many of those, particularly discharge of conditions, that's why they're often the ones that slip slightly in terms of performance. But as you can see, all the other application types, really good performance across that month. And then validation, as always, they're really efficient, 94% validated within 5 working days. I can tell you that's a lot faster than most other local authorities, where it can take 3 or 4 weeks just to get your application on the books. So that's a really efficient performance. And then the workloads, as you can see, fairly even across the teams. And then that chart at the bottom just gives you the year-on-year comparison. And you can see it moves around a bit, but we're sort of a little bit below 2022. There are less applications coming to us, but still at 160 for the month of August, so 164. So there's still plenty of work to be doing. And but we do have a slowdown in housing applications, and that's really about the economic cycle and where we are. But that will probably pick up as interest rates recover and availability of mortgage finance improves. And then just turning over, looking at appeals. Members are aware of the public inquiry starting in here on the 17th of October. That's the Bottisham care home that you saw at the last committee. Remember, you agreed the officer recommendation, and proofs of evidence have been exchanged, and the witnesses, and I think we're working on a legal agreement as well, aren't we, Angela, to get that finished? Because if the inspector wants to allow the appeal, he has to have a legal agreement in place. So we have to prepare for all eventualities in an appeal. And if anyone wants to come and have a look at how that works, that's from the 17th of October down for 6 days. But I think it'll be quicker than that, we hope. And on then the Lazy Otter, you mentioned, Chair, in the briefing, on the enforcement appeal that was dismissed, I think the inspector's giving them 9 months to cease the residential use of that pub. So that would be about May 2024. And then beyond then, if that's not occurred, we would have to look at what to do about that. And then on Oak Lane, Littleport, the business park, mixed bag, some dismissed, some are some allow. What we need to do is a bit of coherence on that site. We need to know what's authorised and what's not. And hopefully we can get that site tidied up in the future. That's it, Chair. I'll take any further questions.
Any questions? Yes, councillor Trapp.
I'm so intrigued by the EN notice quashed. Is that dismissed? I mean, it's a new one on me.
Okay, Chair. Yeah, that's a new, that you don't often see that. Normally what happens is if an inspector thinks an enforcement notice is deficient, the inspector may either allow the appeal and say, I don't agree, there should have been an enforcement notice here, or dismiss the appeal but change the notice and say it just needs to be tidied up. In this particular instance, the inspector said, I don't really understand what the notice says, so quashed it in its entirety. That is quite an unusual outcome. Very rarely do we see
So
that.
it actually means it's been dismissed.
It means it's been dismissed, and yeah, I don't really
Because
know
we-
why it needed to go that far, but they quashed it because I don't think the inspector thought it was clear enough and what we were trying to enforce. That was essentially the outcome.
So it's dismissed because of
Yeah,
uh,
it's
no-
it doesn't exist anymore. It's gone.
right. Okay, thank you.
Well, I think that's it. And thank you very, very much for coming, members, and your contribution has always been welcome. So we'll see you again in another month's time.